Welcome. My name is Michelle Taylor, and I'm an advisor with Luma Wealth. And today we're going to be talking about impact investing. I've been with Luma for the last 8 months, and prior to that, I've spent 24 years in the industry, mainly in the brokerage services side. And it's quite an honor to have my colleague Katie here with us today. Katie actually joins us with 13 years experience from PNC. And she has a list of titles behind her, one being her MBA. She also has her CFA, which is the Chartered Financial Analyst designation, and she most recently has gotten the Chartered Alternative Investment Analyst designation, which is quite a mouthful, Katie.
I can't say it either.
Especially quickly. But Katie is actually overseeing all of our impact investing here at Luma, and we're going to be sharing some of that topic with you today. Before we actually dive into it, I wanted to share some statistics with you about impact. Currently, today, every $1 out of 5 is under these professional strategies, which I found very interesting, which is resulting in more than a 33% increase since 2014. Globally, we're actually seeing about $22 trillion being invested in this manner. And so we're really starting to see the shift that's going from these bigger companies really looking at impact and what that means. One of the things that I am pretty passionate about impact investing is I have a daughter, and when I think about what this means from a social responsible investing standpoint, I want to be able to have a good world for her. And when I think about what she's currently eating or food industries and what she's putting into her body, I start to now wonder a little bit more about what's important to me in the companies that I choose to invest in. And I know, Katie, you have a passion around this, so I'm curious. Just tell me a little bit more about your passion behind it and how you started this.
Sure. So, it's fairly similar. I also have a daughter as well as another daughter on the way, and it's thinking about those future generations and kind of where we are now versus what it could look like 10, 20 years from now, and wanting to make sure that it's a more sustainable future for them. And a big part of it for me that I think gets played down when you think about impact is the diversity aspect. Obviously, being a female in the investment profession, we're far and few between, and I think it's really important for my daughters to see, that this is a career that I'm passionate about and that they can explore these types of careers as well without having to feel that they can't, that there's a barrier there. I think it's been getting better that's not necessarily the case anymore.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll be able to cover more about this today. Really, there's 3 main themes that I want to make sure that everybody takes away today. One being, really, what is the definition of impact investing? Really, what makes a difference and how that is changed from the traditional types of investing. And then lastly, our approach here at Luma and what you're actually doing to make that impact overall on our investment team. So to kick us off, Katie, if you would just give us a little bit of information on how you see this going in the marketplace.
Sure. So, I think it's first important to take a step back and kind of talk about where we've seen impact historically. And, it was more along those socially responsible standards, more of your exclusionary base, and it was really more in the institutional space, so your endowments, your foundations that were more looking at, what are their principles and investing in line with those. And as you've seen in the past 10 years, there's been kind of a shift in how people are thinking about impact and what it means, especially with a lot of the governance and environmental issues that have really been at the forefront. So that's kind of where we've been. In terms of the traction that we see going forward, a big piece of this is, looking at the investment landscape of who's investing now. As you're seeing a lot more women and millennials starting to enter the market, I think that's where you're starting to see a lot of traction with this. That's not to say that men aren't interested in impact. The U.S. Trust study did find that the level of interest among men has actually doubled in the past 2 years. So, we're starting to see it there. It's holistically. It's kind of everyone starting to get an idea of what it is and what it means and starting to at least take interest in it. But, despite that, I think with the women and millennial wealth growth is really where you're going to see this take off Heather Ettinger, founder of Luma. She's co-authored and done a lot of research on women of wealth, and she found that by 2030, women are expected to control 2/3 of the wealth in the U.S. And that's huge. I mean, considering where we've come from, that's a staggering amount. And really, 2030 is not that far away. And women tend to be more philanthropically focused to begin with. So, I think a report from Barclays showed that women on average in the U.S. give about 3.5% of their wealth each year to charities. Right. So, given kind of that dynamic, that's going to be a huge shift towards this type of investing. And then, of course, the millennials, as I mentioned, and I can speak for them as one. This is definitely an area that I think that they're taking an interest to because it just is really in line with their belief system most. That same U.S. Trust study I mentioned for men, in terms of millennials, over half of the respondents that were millennials were interested in impact investing of some type, with 30% already owning these types of investments. Now, of course, millennials, they're still younger, they're still in that wealth accumulation phase, but as that kind of blossoms, especially with $30 trillion in inheritance expected to come to that generation in the next several years, but I think that's really going to be a game changer for impact investing.
So you're right, those are some staggering statistics, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and how this is really changing in the marketplace. Let's take a step back, and let's just start with the definition of impact investing so that we start from a level playing field.
Sure, so I think this is where the waters get really muddy for a lot of people. There's a lot of terms thrown out there that we've already mentioned. There's socially responsible, there's ESG, there's impact, among several others. And some of the difficulty around that is, the term that's being used depends on the source that's using it. And then not only that, you have meanings that are completely different for these terms depending on the source that's using it. So, for example, you may have a principles-based manager that excludes lesbian, gay, bi, trans-focused companies because it's not in line with their values, but they're considered ESG. Whereas on the other hand, you have fund managers that are investing specifically in companies that have that LGBT focus from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, but yet they're still considered ESG. So it's really a very broad area that we're looking at. So at Luma, we took a step back and said, how do we want to look at this? And for us, impact really is the philosophy of what we're doing and the solution that we're providing to our clients. And then we're looking at ESG in terms of the factors that our managers are using in their investment decision-making process. Okay, so we're not looking at these more niche products like that LGBT fund I mentioned. It's more taking the holistic approach of ESG integration with shareholder engagement and advocacy.
Gotcha. So it sounds as if Luma's really taking that lens of the ESG for impact. Maybe take an example. So if we were looking at ESG or impact investing, and you were talking a little bit about some of the restrictions or taking things out, what would that example be? Could you give me an example of what that might look like?
In terms of what does the ESG stand for, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so ESG stands for environmental social governance. I think environmental is the easier one. Let's do pollution control, carbon footprint, more of the more widely known things that people are concerned about with plastic straws and what have you. Social, I think, is where it's a little bit more sticky. Words there or areas you can think of for there is labor relations, workplace safety, diversity, of course, is a big buzzword. And then governance, that's more at the corporate level. So that's looking at board of director, independence, executive compensation, and really just making sure these companies are doing what's in the best interest of all stakeholders.
So it sounds like a lot is starting to change with companies and how they're evaluating this. So when you think about looking at choosing investments into this type of portfolio, how has that changed over time versus, let's say, maybe like that 10 years ago to now? If, for example, I know that oil companies have been a hot topic, along the way because many times those are not looked upon as maybe being environmentally safe or conscious, so people have had different opinions
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, historically it's been more of that exclusionary. So of course oil companies, because of the nature of the business, it's not good for the environment. They typically would not have been included in these portfolios. I think the BP oil spill of 2010 is a great example that didn't help the cause.
Right.
As you may recall, it was an oil spill in the Gulf that had devastating effects, even still, on the ecosystem there. So, I think that was part of it, but as we've seen that shift in how people are thinking about it, it's also taking a look when you're including ESG integration in terms of what are the policies and processes these companies are then putting in place to improve what they're doing. So what are the steps that BP took to increase accountability? They're adding on additional inspections with some of these drillers, and that kind of helps in terms of is that then a company we could add because they are improving those processes and leading the industry as well in terms of what is best practice. So that's an additional kind of layer of that ESG integration. Now, a company like BP, from an environmental standpoint, may not score very well from an environmental standpoint. However, if they're scoring well from a social or governance standpoint, that could offset it, right? And then the overall ESG score would then go up and potentially allow them to be included based on their score. Now, I would caution there are still sectors and industries that may never be included in most ESG portfolios. Tobacco companies is an example of that. They make a product that's just not good for people. It's harmful to health of yourself and others and whoever is around you. So, other than them not making them anymore, but then they go out of business, there's not a lot they can do to improve those processes. So a lot of industries like that still may not be included.
Okay. Also, I guess as part of this, can you tell me more about what you might mean by shareholder engagement and advocacy?
Absolutely. So, as part of what we're doing, I think the shareholder advocacy and engagement is a really big part of our philosophy. It's taking the active managers that we're using and really making sure that they're taking a step further in how they're approaching impact. So you can think of ESG integration, they're the factors, they're making sure these companies are acting in a sustainable way, but it's then taking these active managers that have the scale to then go to the management of these companies and say, hey, we noticed that BP, you may need to improve these processes. How can we help you get there? They're submitting shareholder proposals for their annual meetings that are in line with, we don't think that your board is diverse enough, and we want to see that happen. And so it's a lot of those examples where it's really trying to make a difference. We do at Luma have an impact report that we have recently published that provides a lot of great examples of what the funds we're currently investing with are doing. And I would also add, so there's kind of that investment layer that this is what where your investment dollars are going. But then there's the other side where the managers we're working with are also affiliated with or members of over 35 different organizations dedicated to sustainable investing. So it's beyond just the investing, it's how are they making a difference overall with some of these organizations and lawmakers as well. So it's making a really big difference.
So it's sounding as if it's making these organizations become a little bit more well-rounded overall,
Yes.
not just in certain sectors.
Absolutely.
So that's wonderful, but one of the questions I'm sure that the audience really wants to know about is performance. I mean, if we don't have performance, then a lot of folks are not going to invest in something like this. So talk about performance with me.
Sure. Performance, of course, is the most important to most investors. But I guess first, before we kind of dive into that, is the reason our clients are investing in impact is to make that difference. They want to invest in line with their values. So I think that's the number one goal when you're kind of stepping into this is, why am I doing it? It's to align my values with my investment. So that's number one. That disclosure out of the way. The great part is that what we've seen is typically, these types of investments are still providing returns that are in line with, or sometimes even potentially better than the overall market. So, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds with mixing your investments with your values and still potentially getting that return out of it. The other piece of, the performance component is risk. You have macro risk, which is in terms of if there's going to be a downturn in the economy, if there's a potential for a recession, that would be like the entire stock market, most of the stock market going down, right? That's how you can think about macros. It's all of it going down. Then you have company-specific risk, which is, as the name implies, specific to each company. BP, again, we'll keep going back to them, but poor BP, they were down about 17% in the month following the oil spill, while the rest of the market was still moving up. So that's a really rather extreme but good example of that company-specific risk. With impact, what we're doing is inherently reducing that company-specific risk, right? Because you're taking into consideration a lot of those risk factors when you're making those investment decisions in terms of, is there a potential for an oil spill or a data breach, or are they diverse enough, etc. So you're already taking out some of those elements when you're making that decision. And back to that same study I mentioned earlier about, showing what the performance has been like, the global ESG index has shown that with less risk than the traditional global index. So, the old adage has always been more risk, more return. And what we're seeing with impact is that you're actually getting less risk with generally similar returns.
Okay, first I want to say sign me up if it's less risk and more return. No, in all seriousness, why would everybody not want to then jump right in and go into impact if you're seeing more return and potentially less risk?
Sure, I mean that's a great question. I would love to sign up as well. So, it's a great question. I think a lot of it stems back to rewinding to the beginning of our conversation in terms of this is just starting to gain traction. We're just starting to see the interest really pick up in this way of thinking about investing. So that's part of it. The other piece of it is, the amount of product that's available. A lot of people aren't able to necessarily go out and pick companies based on their ESG scores, what have you. And so they're looking for ETFs, mutual funds, what have you. But they're still just not as plentiful as what you would see on the traditional side. It's getting there. We're seeing products released basically weekly at this point, but I still don't know that for our more risky type investors that there's enough out there to be tactical enough at this point. I would add though, interestingly, some of the fund families that we work with, thinking BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, they recently announced that they are using ESG integration firm-wide. So what does that mean? Whether a fund is mandated to be ESG or not, it will still take into consideration ESG factors in their risk analysis in their investment decision-making process. So that's really neat because it kind of takes away from having that separate product necessarily, and really I think is somewhere the industry is going to be heading anyways.
Thanks for clarifying. So that does help define that a little bit better. And it sounds as if a lot more companies are starting to create a little bit more transparency just overall. You touched on it briefly, but maybe delve a little bit more into your process or Luma's process and the philosophy behind how we're looking at impact for our investors.
Sure. So I guess kind of flip-flopping your questions, but at Luma we're definitely one of the earlier entrants in this space, especially in the Cleveland area, which is something I'm personally really proud of and I think fits really well with what we're doing at Luma in terms of inspiring families, right? And I may be biased a little bit, but I think our investment team does a really great job of trying to get in front of some of these investment themes that we think are likely to stick around. For example, we were one of the earlier adopters of low-cost ETFs, liquid alternatives. So, we're really trying to be engaged in what's going on in the industry and trying to get out ahead of it. And this is just one example of that. In terms of our process, we're just taking our best thinking in terms of asset allocation with that ESG overlay. So it's mirroring our investment strategy, but with an impact lens including the shareholder advocacy and engagement.
I love the way that this is heading. It sounds very exciting. As you talk about this, and you touched on it as well, but when we think about the future, do you think that this is a trend because it's the trendy thing to do, or do you think that this is something that will stay?
I definitely think it's something that'll stay. I think that this is something that's a long time coming, and as I mentioned, you're already seeing a lot of these fund families starting to integrate it firm-wide. It's not just, these ESG products. For now, it may take some time for that to really play out fully, but as far as I see it, I don't know that this is necessarily something that'll be ESG specific, a separate product going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but I definitely think that bottom line, this is not just a fad. I think impact is definitely here for the long term. In one way, shape, or form, it'll be there. So I'm interested to see how it kind of evolves going forward.
Great. Well, Katie, thank you so much. Your passion behind impact investing certainly shines through. Hopefully you all were able to take away those three main themes that we had, and that is get a better understanding of what impact investing is, how it actually differed from the traditional type of investing, and how companies are looking at things differently now, and then Luma's approach. If you would like more information, please visit our website at lumawealth.com, or certainly call us over at Luma Wealth, and one of our advisors can help you. Thanks, Katie.